Hello, watch enthusiasts. Now, as lovers of watches and indeed the mechanisms and the innovation behind them, I think a lot of us appreciate the impressive nature of space travel in terms of the amount of care and attention that needs to be taken for these missions to be successful. And similarly, the glamour side, I suppose, of space travel has never really left people's minds, especially in a field that's so related to mechanisms and indeed design as watches. And so today I'd like to produce a video which has been long in the pipeline, if you will, and which many people have requested, and I'm sorry I haven't produced it until now. But today I'd like to talk about the best and indeed the most interesting watches that were involved with space travel that you can buy. And this does include the one vintage watch, but primarily these watches are indeed watches which are available as new watches. And some of these watches do extend to very high price points, but it's true to say I didn't want to include anything in this video that wasn't directly related to space travel and was simply associated with, as is so often the case. And so I think rather fittingly for today's picture from the Snups group, the Watch Guys, which is my group on Snups, which is a social media platform for collectors where you can share pictures of your collections and also discuss matters of horology with myself and the other enthusiasts, and where I'll be more than happy to reply to any questions personally and be able to answer any queries you might have. But today's picture, we have this tremendous picture of a Speedmaster X33 next to a proper professional, giving the full spectrum really of the classic Speedmaster next to its modern iteration. And so if you would like to join the group and enjoy the additional features that I offer in terms of being able to ask myself and other enthusiasts questions, then do follow the link down below to join the group and be able to join in with the other 9,000 people involved. Now, the first watch I'd like to talk about finds its origins in the period when Zenith, a collaboration between Heuer, Breitling, Hamilton, Buren and Dubois de Pras, and Seiko were competing to produce the first automatic chronograph caliber. And many people agree that the Zenith El Primero was the first to be produced, but it's still disputed as to whether it was in fact this or whether it was the Heuer and Breitling, Hamilton, Buren and Dubois de Pras collaboration, which was their caliber 11. And the difference between these two calibers was that the Heuer movement was in fact a piece which was modular, so it had a Hamilton-Buren micro-rotor movement with a Dubois de Pras timing module placed on the top. By contrast, the Zenith was a high-beat integrated movement whereby the whole thing worked together and was built from the ground up. And of course, famously, Zenith was congratulated by Seiko for the production of their El Primero movement, without any word being mentioned about the fact that Seiko themselves were in this competition, and were competing with the caliber 6139A. And this was a column wheel automatic chronograph movement, which actually hit markets in May of 1969. And this happened significantly earlier than the movements from indeed the other two brands, which arrived in June and July. And so these movements were really quite legendary, and made their way into these Seiko watches, making this watch the first serially produced automatic chronograph. However, this watch's association with space began in truth in 1973, but prior to this began with Colonel William Pogue, a NASA astronaut, buying himself for training one of these Seikos, a 6139-6002, which has now been nicknamed the Pogue. And this model was used by this individual during training for the Skylab 4 mission, and indeed, because he'd been using it so often with regards to training, he decided to bring it with him into space, keeping it in a pocket when he was being given the Speedmaster that he would officially be wearing. And though he didn't wear this outside the capsule, he wore this watch and preferred it to the Speedmaster he used, simply because he was used to wearing this watch, which makes this watch a fantastically affordable piece if you're looking at buying a vintage one. And these watches themselves are 40mm stainless steel timepieces with very 70s styling, with these sharp edges, but whilst having this barrel case, which is a soft curve, which gives a very typical style of that era, and I think is very charming in its design. And it's worth noting that the Pogue version of this watch, of the 6139-6002, is the version with the gold dial. And these watches also came with an internal bezel, as you can see, which was graduated from 1 to 60. And this was a bezel which came in either black or indeed in the same colour as the dial, that golden orange. And it's worth noting that these do fade over time, so the colour of that yellow sometimes doesn't match the dial because it's faded to a lesser style of saturation. But these feature a 30-minute chronograph running at the bottom of the dial with a day-date complication as well. And they do offer a remarkable amount of value because they are available for between £200 and about £450, which makes for a remarkable buy bearing in mind the history of these watches. And they also feature interesting touches like that bezel, featuring a tachometer that runs from in fact 50 to 250, rather than running from 400 or 500 back to 60, for ease of use when on the ground, though of course this doesn't really apply to space travel, as this watch was never built for it. And of course the resistance of these watches is legendary, bearing in mind they survived that Skylab mission, the Skylab 4 mission in 1973, with really flying colours. There were no problems reported by this particular kernel. And of course the design of the watch is very typical to this watch, so you won't mistake this for anything else. And it has interesting details like the fact that the crown is fully recessed into the case, so it can't be bumped, and the pushes are the only bits that protrude from the side, which I feel is a touch which is very well considered and does add to Seiko's clear aim to make this a usable and functional sports watch. And so for someone who's looking for a watch which is interesting, mechanical, and has a real history in terms of the use in space, and who's happy to accept a vintage watch, these are tremendous pieces, and it's worth noting that these golden dialed versions do command a certain premium over the other dial versions, so that is something worth considering. But nonetheless, you are getting a heck of a lot of watch for the money, with a very interesting history, and a very unique style of design. Now this next watch story is one of the most interesting, I feel, because it's a story which we actually know remarkably little of. Because between 1970 and 1971, astronaut Dave Scott was approached by Bulova with regards to the watch he was going to wear for Apollo 15. And officially, every astronaut was going to wear an Omega Speedmaster Professional, as per the fact that they were certified and tested by NASA. But Dave Scott was approached by Bulova with a gift of a one-off chronograph, which I'll talk about in more detail in a moment. And so he took this along with the prescribed Omega Speedmaster into space. But so the story goes, he bumped the Speedmaster on the way to the moon and knocked the crystal clean off it, thus rendering the watch pretty much useless, as it had to be dust resistant on the moon. And so as a result, he took that off and replaced it with the Bulova he had with him. And so as a result, when he landed on the moon, and was in fact the first individual to use the Lunar rover, he wore this Bulova, this personal Bulova, making it the only watch ever to go on sale, and the only watch to ever be on the moon as a personal timepiece that wasn't owned by NASA, and he returned to NASA after the mission. And the design of the watch in question is immediately recognisable as a space-styled watch, with a fairly simple bead-blasted case, those very easily pushed pushers, as well as a matte black dial with a tricompax layout, and very legible hands and indices, with a tachometer on it as well, though in this case the bezel is actually underneath the crystal rather than being outside it, underneath that thick box crystal. And this watch didn't beat the Seiko I just showed you as being the first automatic watch in space, because this was a manually wound chronograph. But nonetheless, due to its unique nature, it sold for $1.625 million in 2015 at auction. And over a year ago, Bulova produced a re-edition of this watch with their newer quartz caliber as a sort of a commemorative piece to that watch. And the price of this watch is between £350 and £500, depending on where you look, because these watches are sometimes discounted if they're reaching the end of their batches. But this features a large 45mm case, but with a remarkably short lug-to-lug distance, making it very wearable for most users, and indeed I was able to wear one for a while, and I must say it was very comfortable to use. And the case of the watch is bead-blasted as with the original, but we see extra detailing on the polished pushers and that polished crown. Additionally, the pushers are very nicely hinged, and you can see the screws for those in the case back, which means that they fold in rather than pressing in like a normal pusher would, making them very ergonomic and easy to use, whilst not being susceptible to bumps and knocks as a result of their smooth shape. The dial is matte black with these sunburst sunken subdials, with a flowing second hand, so rather than ticking every second, it actually beats very nicely. Additionally, the running seconds at 6 o'clock beat twice a second, which breaks it up a bit and makes it appear less like a quartz movement. And for the price, the detailing of this watch is really excellent, with a fantastically secure feel to the crown when being used, and very clear and bright BGW9 superluminova on the dial, which makes this watch extremely legible even in the lowest of light situations, and in fact its lume is comparable in terms of longevity to a professional dive watch. And in keeping with the original, the tachometer is housed beneath that box sapphire crystal, which extends very nicely from the case, and from a brushed bezel around it. And this watch does in fact feature all three styles of standard finishing, which is nice to see. And the movement inside the watch is a 262 kHz in-house movement from Bulova, though in terms of architecture it is derived from a Miyota movement. And so as a result it has a flowing second hand, as I've said, and does have a very secure action in terms of the way the pushers press, which aren't squishy at all, but rather have a very firm and decisive click. And this does make a watch which is altogether extremely well made, and a really wonderful choice for someone who wants something a bit different, but who wants a style of space watch which is unmistakable in terms of its design, but is something different to, for example, an Omega Speedmaster, at a far more affordable price. And it is worth noting that Bulova have been able to make this movement accurate 10 seconds a year, which I think is a remarkable achievement and something which in many ways allows this watch to hold its own against mechanical alternatives, because it's not simply a cut-budget version of a mechanical watch, but rather offers you something completely different in terms of accuracy. And so as a result, I can see this watch coexisting very peacefully with a Speedmaster in the same collection. And the watch comes on two strap variations. Either you can have it in a package whereby it comes with a textured leather strap which resembles carbon fibre, which in my eyes is a little bit too stiff for my liking, but that said, it's very much a matter of opinion. And that also comes with a Velcro nylon strap with a nubuck patch denoting the times of the mission, which is more similar to the type of strap that would have been worn by the astronauts. Alternatively, you can get a version with the bracelet, with a brushed solid bracelet, which is a nice option as well. But it's worth considering the fact that if you think that you'll want the bracelet later on down the line, I would recommend you buy the version with the bracelet to start off with, because the holes in the lugs are in different positions depending on the model, which is an area where I think Bulova have really messed up designing this watch, because there really should be a single universal model. But this means you can't put a bracelet on a strap version, which means I would recommend you buy the bracelet version and then put it on a strap, rather than vice versa. The third watch on this list is a piece which comes in two versions, a three-hand version and a chronograph model. And the story of this watch begins in 1994, when the Russian Federal Space Agency, with the new missions to the Mir space station, decided to take on Fortis as their watchmaker of choice. And Fortis produced the Cosmonaut in two versions, which are currently available today, as I've said, the three-hand and the chronograph. And there are more fancy versions with ceramic bezels and tachymeters, but in truth these two are the closest to the ones used by the astronauts. And in fact these versions still are used by astronauts, and indeed these are the most prolific space watches of all time, having completed over 100,000 orbits, because it's known that Russia does spend more time with the space station style of space exploration by doing experiments up there, and thus their watches spend longer in the orbit of the Earth. And so as a result, these watches have experienced the greatest space time, despite the fact that they've been used for far less time than the Speedmaster from Omega. And whilst other automatic watches have been worn in space, and indeed other automatic chronographs, this was the first automatic watch to be worn on the wrist of an astronaut outside the capsule in outer space. And I must say this does add a certain awe to this, because it's true, when one thinks about it, the only thing keeping the watch on the wrist of an astronaut is the bracelet or strap. And that's the only thing holding this watch from floating off into space, which is a strange and an interesting concept, and I think is a testament to how tough these watches are. And both versions of this watch feature a 42mm brushed case with a very simple design at its base, with a round shape with lugs jutting out, which give it a fairly short and stubby length, which is useful for smaller wrists. The design of the watch also features a unidirectional bezel, which is graduated every minute with lume at 12 o'clock on a pip, and this is extremely legible and useful if you're using that alongside a chronograph. Then, in terms of the water resistance and resistance of the case altogether, it's anti-magnetic and shock resistant, as you would expect, to be able to resist the surroundings in space, whether it be the shocks of being bumped around, or indeed simply being around a lot of machinery which gives off a magnetic field which could affect the timekeeping of this watch. It really is secure. Additionally, it is water resistant to 200 metres without having screw-down pushers, which is a nice touch, and allows the watch to be resistant when they land in the sea, though of course the Russians land on land rather than in the sea, unlike NASA. And small touches like, for example, the fact that arrows sit alongside the date window and the day window, which show you which way to turn the crown in that second position to adjust either one of those displays, which is a nice touch and not something I'd considered before being useful, but it's true if you're trying to keep a watch as accurate as possible whilst changing these things, it is useful not to make that mistake. The watches also feature screwed lugs rather than having a spring bar, which again adds to the sturdiness of the bracelets of these watches, which are all solid steel, and which can be taken apart piece from piece rather than simply having a certain section of links which can be removed and adjusted. Here the whole bracelet can be taken apart with a small tool, which is extremely good in terms of being able to repair a single link if it's near the case, without having to replace the whole bracelet. And the three-hand version is in many ways the cleanest version of the watch, with simply the time, with the hours, the minutes and the seconds, as well as day-date complication courtesy of the ETA 2836 used inside this watch. However, if the £1,399 version with all of those parameters and built-to space specification with the three hands isn't quite enough functionality, then for £2,550, which admittedly is a significant price jump, but I feel offers a lot in return, you can get the chronograph version. And this is fitted with the venerable Veljour 7750, which is a very well-used automatic caliper, and is extremely reliable and easy to repair by really any watchmaker worth his salt. And the design of the watch has hints of German Flieger, with that style of marker at 12 o'clock, and the indices around the dial with the numerals next to them. But it's been completely modernised with straight loomed hands, and a colour-coordinated setup whereby everything that's to do with daily timekeeping is in white, whereas everything to do with the chronograph is in orange, which is very similar to things like racing dial Omega Speedmaster Mark IIs, which of course weren't used in space, but nonetheless. And this does make the watch far more legible to glance, with that 12-hour chronograph, with that wonderful loomed second hand. And despite the not inconsiderable price of this watch, I think that it's worth really every penny, because this is a small brand with really fantastic history, and with a reputation for extremely high-quality products built to the specifications needed for these astronauts. And of course it's worth noting that Fortis were the first to use automatic movements, so again I think it's fairly fitting that Fortis were the first watch in outer space with an automatic movement. So I think really whichever version of these watches you buy, you really can't go wrong with these pieces if you're after a robust and solid piece, which also has that space heritage. Now the popularity of this penultimate watch is very much put down to Reinhard Furrer, who was a German physicist on the Spacelab Space Shuttle mission, which was the STS-61A D1 mission. And this was a West German funded mission in 1985, which was equipped with the Space Shuttle Discovery. And during this mission, this physicist chose to wear his own Sinn 140S. And this was a very curious chronograph from Sinn, with a Lemania 5100 movement, with a central minute and central second chronograph, which is something which is relatively rare but has seen a comeback in recent years, because it is just such an attractive way of laying out that chronograph setup. And the presence of this watch on the mission is very well documented, with it being seen on his wrist both at press events, and indeed this PVD black watch being seen inside the space shuttle on his wrist. So really this was a complete package in terms of offering a very usable and functional timepiece, with of course that fantastic dark coating which made reflections all the less. And it's true to say that this watch was for a very long time seen as the first automatic chronograph used in space, until someone realised that Pogue had worn his Seiko. But this watch does have a great deal of fame as well in terms of Sinn's eyes, because they view this watch as a symbolic demonstration of the fact that a professional buys their watches. They don't supply their watches for publicity stunts, but purely for professionals who buy the watches themselves, which I think does add to the credibility of Sinn as a true sports watch and tool watch manufacturer. Now the sizing of the modern watch is quite curious, because at 44mm one might expect it to be overbearing, but it's only 46mm from lug to lug, making it almost square, which means that it will fit even the smallest of wrists, with a lug-to-lug distance of a dress watch really in terms of length. The thickness is somewhat more imposing at 15mm, but nonetheless for a resistant watch like this, with this many features, one wouldn't expect any thinner than that. And the amount of features on this watch is remarkable, and internally the watch features the caliber SZ01 from Sinn themselves, which is derived from a Veljour 7750 chronograph movement, but where they've moved the setup for the minutes to that central section. And the display is immediately legible thanks to the use of red on black, with the red second hand for the chronograph, as well as the red minute hand and the red hand for the hours. And this gives the watch a very quickly legible setup, whereby due to that aeroplane motif on the minute hand, you can very quickly pick that apart from the second hand. Additionally, the other hands are painted in white, which again makes them far easier to decipher from the others, and there is an internal rotating bezel which rotates bidirectionally via that crown at 10 o'clock, which gives this watch a great deal of additional functionality which wouldn't have been there originally, which means that you can use this watch for timing multiple events at the same time. And despite the fact that it now has additional holes cut into the case at 10 o'clock for that secondary crown for turning that internal bezel, the watch is still water resistant to 100 metres, which is perfectly adequate for getting this watch wet or swimming with it. And then, of course, there are also Sinn's proprietary technologies which are used in this watch extensively, bearing in mind that this is very much at the top of Sinn's range. And the watch is fully tegamented, so it has this hardened surface coating and treatment to the steel, which makes it much more scratch resistant and indeed shock resistant on its surface. And this matches the movement, which is of course shock resistant and anti-magnetic, meaning this watch is not very susceptible to external elements, which is of course perfect for a space watch like this. And then of course there is the AR dehumidifying technology, which is seen in all of Sinn's high-end pieces. And this is a technology whereby the inside of the case isn't filled with air, but rather with argon, which is far less reactive than oxygen in air, and thus doesn't react with the metals in the movement, or indeed the oils, so they last longer. Additionally, it has a copper sulfate capsule embedded in the case, which those who remember their chemistry from school will remember that absorbs water and turns blue in the process, thus telling you when it's absorbed a significant amount of moisture, thus preventing the inside of the watch from fogging up, or indeed damage to the movement from that humidity. This watch is available in both PVD versions, and that is a hard coating over a tegamented surface, which means that you don't actually get the ease of abrasion seen on normal PVD, which is something worth noting, bearing in mind the fact that the PVD is more expensive. But if you prefer a simple stainless steel version, then there is that also available. And prices do vary within that range, and due to those different styles. And of course, this is also down to the fact the watch comes on either the bracelet or a leather strap. And the prices range from £3,370 to £4,090, which is a significant amount of money, but I feel you are getting a heck of a lot of watch, and a piece which really will satisfy someone in whatever application they want to have for a chronograph or a technical chronograph of this type. And of course, the final watch I'd like to talk about is the Omega Speedmaster, because this is the classic, the icon really of space. And I would say that, with the possible exception of the Rolex Submariner, is the most iconic watch ever made. And I think for many reasons that this has caught the imagination of a lot of people in terms of its feats in space. But certainly this is the most accomplished space watch there is, and a fascinating one. And the story of this watch really begins in 1962, when the existing model CK2998 was worn by Wally Schirra in space. And this watch was never designed to be a space watch. It had hands that were polished steel. It had a case which didn't have the lug or indeed crown or pusher protection that the later lyre lugs or twisted lugs had, and it didn't have the highly legible dial of the professional models. But what it did demonstrate was that the chronograph was of use to an astronaut, and that NASA should invest in this. And though I won't go into too many details in this video, because I produced a video exclusively on this subject, which I'll link to the video, this was a tipping point, because Omega then started to experiment with different brands in terms of being able to figure out exactly which timepiece would perform best in space. And after testing the watches that they were given through an enormous amount of punishment, from immense changes in temperature from 70 degrees into the minuses in very short periods of time, as well as vibration tests, shock tests, and a great many other styles of tests for these watches, which I did talk about in more detail in that particular video I mentioned, they were able to establish that the Speedmaster was the best option with its 321 caliber movement, which has become a real icon with its column wheel and manually wound winding. And as a result, by the time the moon landings occurred in 1969, Omega had produced this professional model with these white hands, with the iconic twisted lugs, and of course with the design which would remain really unchanged until the present day. And just before the moon landings, Omega actually were going to change the movement from the 321 to the later 861. And the 861 was never made into that Apollo 11 moonwatch, but subsequently it did become the movement used in all Speedmasters throughout most of the second half of the 20th century. And this was updated in the 90s into what we currently have, which is the 1861. And this movement has remained unchanged really, apart from some decoration and a few minor adjustments from 1969, which is still available in the Omega Speedmaster Professional, which creates a heritage which is just unrivaled in terms of originality to the true version of this watch. And the crowning glory really comes with the fact that today this is the only watch that NASA uses as their supplied watch to astronauts, which is remarkable and I think adds only more to the heritage of this watch. And the modern version, which now costs between £3,520 and £4,160, depending on whether you get the sapphire crystal or the Hesselite crystal, still offers very much the same thing, with that 1861 caliber, the 42mm diameter, those twisted lugs, and of course the fact that this watch has one of the cleanest, most legible dials seen to date, with a fantastic engagement for the chronograph, and really build quality which is unrivaled in terms of durability, because this movement is fundamentally rather basic in its form and hasn't changed very much, and so as a result it's very reliable, which is a real benefit to having one of these watches rather than an alternative. One other alternative for £3,520 on a leather strap is the first Omega in Space model, and this is a replica really of that CK2998 worn by Wally Shearer prior to the Speedmaster Professional, with the 39.7mm case, which is far more dressy and far more understated than the Professional, without the crown or indeed pusher guards, and a far cleaner style of hands, with the polished steel hands rather than the painted hands, which is very elegant and is an interesting alternative with a beautiful box sapphire crystal, as well as a fantastic case back and the same caliber 1861. And so I'll conclude the video here, but do leave your comments down below as to what you thought of these options, and if you thought there were any that I missed and should have included. So if you did enjoy the video, then please do like, share and subscribe to help the channel and to be able to enjoy more content here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Sam the Watch Guy, over and out.